September 1938. A 69-year-old man climbs the steps of an airplane for the very first time in his life. He is Neville Chamberlain, the Prime Minister of Great Britain, and he is terrified of flying. He has never done it before. But he is about to fly into the heart of Germany, alone, to sit across a table from Adolf Hitler. Because he believes he is the one man who can talk the world out of another war. He genuinely believes it. And in 3 days' time, tens of thousands of people will pour into the streets to cheer him as the savior of peace, the man who looked into the abyss and stepped Europe back from it. Within 6 months, every promise he carries home in his pocket will be worthless. And the deal this earnest, decent old man is flying off to make will go down as one of the most catastrophic miscalculations in the history of the world. It was the moment the West tried to buy off a dictator and taught him instead that he could take whatever he wanted. The country on that table, the one whose life was being bargained over, was Czechoslovakia. It was young, barely 20 years old, stitched together out of the wreckage of the last war. But it was something rare in Central Europe in 1938, a real functioning democracy, prosperous, with a strong industrial base and, crucially, a serious army. Its western frontier ran through a rim of mountains, and along those mountains the Czechs had built a line of modern fortifications, concrete, guns, defensible ground. Behind it stood some 35 divisions, and on paper, Czechoslovakia was not alone. It had a treaty with France and another with the Soviet Union, both pledged to come to its aid. Remember that, because it is the whole tragedy of what follows. Unlike Austria, Czechoslovakia could fight. If anyone was ever going to stop Hitler with something other than a stern letter, this was the place, and 1938 was the year. He was reaching for a country that could actually hit back. So he found a way in. Tucked into that mountainous western rim lived around 3 million German speakers, the so-called Sudeten Germans, people who had ended up inside Czechoslovakia when the mapmakers drew the borders in 1919. And here was the same key Hitler had used on Austria, a German-speaking population just over the line, whom he could claim to be rescuing. He gave the job of stirring a pot to a local Nazi named Konrad Henlein, whose party manufactured a steady stream of grievance and unrest, each demand carefully designed never to be satisfied. Then Hitler took the stage himself and began to howl. The Sudeten Germans, he raged, were being brutalized, persecuted, denied their right to be German, and he, their protector, would not stand for it much longer. He started massing troops on the Czech border and let the word go out that he was prepared to go to war over it. By September 1938, Europe was staring at the real thing. Not a bloodless march into an undefended zone, an actual war, one that could pull in France and Britain and drag the whole continent back into the horror it had crawled out of only 20 years before. In London, they dug trenches in the parks and handed out gas masks. Everyone remembered the last war. Nobody could stomach another. And that terror is the lever Hitler was pulling. He was betting, again, that the man across the table would give up almost anything rather than fight. He was right about one of them, because Neville Chamberlain was determined to save the peace, and he thought he could do it by giving Hitler enough of what he wanted to make him stop. It had a name, appeasement, and Chamberlain pursued it with the desperate energy of a man who had seen the last war's cemeteries and could not bear to fill new ones. So he flew, not once, 3 times in the space of 2 weeks. First to Hitler's mountain retreat at Berchtesgaden, where Hitler demanded the Sudetenland be handed over. Chamberlain went home, leaned on the French, and even leaned on the Czechs to give it up, and then flew back a second time to Godesberg, carrying the surrender Hitler had asked for. And there Hitler did something revealing. Handed exactly what he'd demanded, he raised the price. Now he wanted it faster, harder, with more humiliation attached, as if he were almost trying to provoke a war rather than win a gift. Even Chamberlain wavered. For a few days at the end of September, Europe genuinely believed the bombs were about to fall. Then, at the last moment, a conference was called. Munich. On the 29th of September, 1938, 4 men met in a grand building in the center of Munich to decide the fate of Czechoslovakia. Hitler for Germany, Mussolini for Italy, Daladier for France, and Chamberlain for Britain. Notice who is not in that room. There was no one there from Czechoslovakia, the country whose borders, whose fortresses, whose future were being sliced up and handed away. Its own government was not permitted a seat at the table. 2 Czech diplomats were made to wait in a nearby hotel under what amounted to guard, to be informed after the fact of what the great powers had decided to do with their homeland. They decided to give it to Hitler. In the early hours of the 30th, the 4 men signed. The Sudetenland, with its mountains, its guns, its fortifications, the entire defensible frontier of the Czechoslovak state, was to be handed to Germany within days. The Czechs were simply told to comply. Abandoned by France, sold by Britain, and facing Germany alone, they had no choice. They gave up their wall without a shot, and everything behind it lay open. And Neville Chamberlain flew home believing he had saved the world. What happened next is one of the most famous scenes of the 20th century. Chamberlain stepped off the plane at the airfield outside London and held up a single sheet of paper over his head, a declaration he and Hitler had signed, promising the 2 nations would never go to war with each other again. The crowd went wild. That evening, outside Downing Street, he spoke the words that would follow him to his grave. "I believe," he said, "it is peace for our time." For a few golden weeks, he was the most beloved man in Britain. He had done the impossible. He had looked into the eyes of the dictator and come home with peace in his pocket. Not everyone was cheering. In the House of Commons, a political outcast named Winston Churchill, ignored, mocked, warning about Hitler for years to a chamber that wished he'd be quiet, rose to give his verdict on Munich. "We have sustained," he said, "a total and unmitigated defeat." The choice, as he saw it, had been between war and dishonor. Britain had chosen dishonor, and, he promised, it would get the war anyway. He was nearly shouted down. Most of the country thought he was a warmonger spoiling the celebration. Most of the country was wrong. Because here's what Chamberlain had actually done. He had not stopped Hitler. He had handed him, without a fight, the one country in Central Europe that might have. Overnight, Czechoslovakia lost its mountains, its fortress line, and any means of defending itself. And Hitler had learned, one more time and more powerfully than ever, the only lesson he ever really absorbed. Threaten hard enough, and the democracies will fold. They will even hold your coat while you rob their friends. The paper was worthless, and Hitler proved it in about 5 months. In March 1939, he turned on what was left of Czechoslovakia, the rump state, now stripped of its defenses that the Munich deal had promised to protect. He summoned its elderly president, a frail man named Emil Hacha, to Berlin in the middle of the night, and went to work on him. For hours the Germans bullied and threatened, warning that the Luftwaffe would flatten Prague by morning if he did not surrender his nation. The old man's heart gave out under the strain. He collapsed and had to be revived with an injection so the browbeating could continue. Sometime around 4 in the morning, broken, he signed his country away. On the 15th of March, German troops rolled into Prague, and Czechoslovakia ceased to exist. And this time, there was no fig leaf. There were no oppressed Germans to rescue here. These were Czechs, Slavs, a foreign people Hitler now simply swallowed by force, in open daylight, in violation of the agreement he had signed 6 months earlier with his own hand. The excuse was gone. The naked thing underneath it was finally on full display. Something broke in London that week. Chamberlain, the man who had trusted the paper, at last understood he had been played for a fool from the beginning, that Hitler's word was worth nothing, that there was no demand that would ever be his last. The scales fell away. Within 2 weeks, Britain did the thing it had spent years avoiding. It drew a line. It publicly guaranteed the independence of the next country on Hitler's list, promising that if Germany attacked it, Britain would go to war. That country was Poland. The age of the stern letter was over. For 6 years, the men across the table had flinched and folded and told themselves that this concession would be the one that satisfied him. Now the flinching had stopped, but so had the time to stop him cheaply. Hitler had a rebuilt army, the factories of a swallowed nation, and an unshakable belief that his enemies would never truly fight. He had one more demand to make. It concerned a port city on the Baltic, cut away from Germany after the last war, with a name the world was about to hear shouted from every newspaper and every radio. Danzig.